instantly grabs central space, opening diagonals for the queen and bishop. Challenging the center's dominion, this Sicilian defense immediately injects asymmetry, creating imbalanced play for both sides. Initiating development, preparing for central pawn expansion while simultaneously keeping options open for different Sicilian variations. Immediately challenging the central pawn and developing a knight, Nf6 initiates a classic Sicilian counterattack, forcing white to consider pawn structure and piece placement. Developing the knight to c3 contests the center and prepares d4, embracing the typical Sicilian pawn structure. Challenging the center immediately, 3. d5 boldly strikes at white's pawn structure, creating immediate dynamic imbalances. Challenging black's central pawn structure, white imposes immediate kingside pressure by forcing a piece exchange or a defensive concession. Forcing the bishop to reveal its retreat path sets up potential piece exchanges, simplifying the center. Aggressively pushing forward, this pawn creates immediate tension, forcing black's knight to an uncertain future square. Black boldly pushes the pawn, immediately creating central space and pinning the knight, a daring territorial grab forcing white to reevaluate its piece development. This exchange strategically resolves central pawn tension, opening lines for active piece deployment by white while forcing black to reassess their pawn structure. Sacrificing the knight on c3 opens up a fascinating positional battle, sacrificing material for a dangerous initiative and control of key central squares, aiming to overwhelm white's pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure aims to disrupt black's development and create attacking chances. White courts immediate piece activity, betting that the weakened kingside will compensate for the material deficit. Observe how the doubled pawns will soon become a significant weakness for black's defense. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop immediately opens a dangerous diagonal towards white's exposed king, forcing a reactive sequence and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure further by capturing the central pawn. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen fundamentally alters the board's complexion, creating a sharp imbalance by sacrificing material for central control and immediate pressure. This assertive recapture, though forcing a king reveal, demands vigilant piece coordination from white to exploit the exposed black monarch and the compromised pawn structure. Clearing the immediate pawn capture unlocks a promising diagonal for black's bishop, simultaneously developing it to a more active square where it eyes white's weakened kingside structure. This pawn sacrifice by white, designed to disrupt black's structure, has now opened up some lines for counterplay. Unlocking the h1a8 diagonal, this bishop repositioning prepares for rapid development and potentially aggressive central thrusts, while simultaneously bolstering control over crucial squares that might otherwise become targets. Developing the queen to c7 now begins to address the lingering issues of piece activity and king safety on the queen side, simultaneously challenging white's central control and preparing to connect the rooks once the opportunity arises. Securing the king behind a castled structure signals a shift towards positional play, aiming to consolidate the gains from the opening exchanges and prepare for potential middle-game operations. Pushing the pawn forward like this aims to disrupt white's bishop and develop a strong central presence, but it opens lines and creates weaknesses that might be exploited later. Reclaiming the pawn on e4, white repositions their bishop to a potent diagonal, eyeing the dark squares around black's uncastled monarch while simultaneously threatening the c4 pawn and creating dynamic counterplay on the queen side. Boldly challenging the central pawn structure, nc6 injects a fresh wave of activity, threatening to pry open the queen side and destabilize white's pawn front. Redirecting queen pressure towards the king side now aims to exploit black's somewhat compromised pawn structure, especially the central weakness around f7. Unleashing a pawn storm towards the enemy king, black disrupts white's piece coordination and aims to exploit the exposed central squares, though this aggressive advance also creates potential weaknesses in black's own pawn structure. Finally, white strikes back at the encroaching pawn storm, reclaiming a vital central square and initiating a positional struggle for control of the open files that now dominate the board. Exploiting the pin on the bishop, black forcefully liberates their pinned piece, immediately threatening the crucial queenside pawn structure and potentially opening lines towards white's king. Seizing the open b-file immediately, white aims to exploit black's slightly dispersed pieces and potentially target the queenside pawn structure, creating dynamic play. Embracing the chaos, black's king now ventures onto a potentially precarious path, mirroring white's aggressive pawn push, aiming to ignite attacking sparks on the queenside while leaving their own royal figure exposed. Pressing the attack on black's weakened kingside while simultaneously contesting the open c-file, this move seeks to exploit the disarray in the opponent's position and regain the initiative after a complex opening sequence. Initiating counterplay by targeting white's advanced pawn and demanding a response to the newly acquired central space, this move simultaneously strengthens black's queen's defense and prepares for potential piece activation. The queen's bold foray to c3 seizes the pawn and opens a vital diagonal, creating immediate pressure on black's rook. This aggressive centralization, however, leaves white's king slightly exposed and potentially isolates the rook on b1 if black can effectively counter. It's a move that prioritizes immediate material gain and central activity over a completely secure king. Embracing immediate chaos, black sacrifices a piece for aggressive initiative, aiming to dismantle the pawn structure around the white king and create open lines for their own pieces, potentially overloading white's defenders. Unleashing the knight to h5 creates immediate pressure on the black king's sanctuary, forcing a recalculation of defensive lines and potentially opening avenues for a kingside assault by exposing weaknesses around the g7 bishop. The unleashed rook now joins the fray, eyeing the exposed white king and initiating a desperate bid to destabilize white's apparently solid central structure. Black seeks to exploit the doubled pawns and the g-file's potential, aiming to disrupt white's pawn cohesion and create immediate threats against the monarch. This aggressive stance is a direct response to white's recent capture, a clear signal that black is not content to defend passively, but will actively seek counterplay and complication. White's recapture on e4 injects immediate tactical life into a previously positional skirmish, creating dual threats against black's doubled pawns and a potentially exposed king. The knight's new outpost disrupts black's carefully constructed pawn chain and opens avenues for further white pressure on the kingside. This knight's audacious leap to d4 aims to disrupt white's queenside initiative and force concessions, transforming a passive position into a dynamic battlefield. The immediate pressure on the bishop and the potential for further infiltration create a fascinating tactical puzzle for white. The board now opens up dramatically, revealing a desperate scramble for white. Your queen's capture on c7 initiates a king hunt, forcing black's monarch into the open. This bold exchange, though sacrificing material, aims to exploit the exposed position of the black king and the potential for a swift attack on the weakened central dark squares. Consider how this trade influences the pawn structure and the development of your remaining pieces in the subsequent pursuit. The king's desperate flight across the board now forces it into a perilous central position, a cardinal sin in open positions, leaving it exposed to the relentless scrutiny of white's remaining pieces and potentially creating a significant long-term weakness. Initiating a strategic retreat for the knight, allowing the king to achieve greater shelter behind its pawns. The pressure on the c7 square has evaporated with the queen's repositioning, and this knight now seeks a more active post, potentially eyeing the f5 or e4 squares to contest black's central pawn advances. White is effectively reorganizing after the tactical skirmishes, aiming to consolidate their material advantage and prepare for the inevitable endgame where the extra pawn could become decisive. Black's king on the queen side remains a significant concern, potentially a target once white's pieces achieve better coordination. Re-establishing piece activity is paramount for black following white's queen's sacrifice, and this bishop redeployment offers a glimmer of hope by eyeing the weakened kingside and potentially activating the rook on d8. Prying open the e-file, white aims to activate the rook and put pressure on black's somewhat exposed king, initiating a contest for control of the central files that could prove decisive. Exploiting the king's exposed position, this capture immediately injects a sharp tactical element into the position, forcing white to confront a direct threat to their monarch's safety and the immediate loss of material if not adequately defended. Unleashing a dazzling discovered check, white forces black's king onto a more precarious square, transforming the central tension into a direct attack on the monarch. A crucial defensive maneuver is undertaken to protect the beleaguered monarch from the relentless knight and bishop battery. This defensive act aims to re-establish some pawn presence on the d-file, hoping to ward off immediate tactical threats. Unleashing a check that forces the opponent's king to a more exposed square, this move leverages the bishop's diagonal control to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially open lines towards their vulnerable monarch. A desperate attempt to shield the beleaguered monarch, this retreat to c8 sacrifices any hope of actively coordinating pieces, effectively burying the king deeper in a minefield of open lines and attacking potential for the opponent. Sensing a winning advantage, the rook actively seizes an open file, preparing to join the attack and exert pressure on the isolated black king. The king's newfound central access, though momentarily liberating, now exposes it to a direct confrontation with white's remobilized pieces, a stark contrast to its prior protective shelter. The d-file opens dramatically, a sudden chasm appearing for the rook to exploit, aiming squarely at the exposed black king that suddenly lost its protective shield. Sensing an imminent endgame, black repositions their monarch to avoid the impending discovered attack along the d-file, aiming to consolidate their slightly better pawn structure before the major pieces are exchanged. Reclaiming lost material while simultaneously initiating a pawn advance that aims to disrupt black's entrenched pieces. The sudden eruption of rook to g2 check signifies a desperate attempt to leverage the open g-file, hoping to disrupt the white king's newfound safety and create counterplay through a series of forcing moves that might just overwhelm the opponent's defenses in the chaotic aftermath. Initiating a perilous retreat, white steers the monarch to safety, accepting the sacrifice to consolidate material while deliberately forfeiting the initiative, a gamble that hinges entirely on black's ability to convert the ensuing pawn majority before white's rooks become fully mobilized on the open files. A critical juncture where even a single tempo miscalculation could prove fatal for the king. Securing a foothold for the pawn on b6 subtly prepares to challenge white's central rook control and potentially create a new avenue of attack along the queen side, all while waiting for the opportune moment to activate the bishop on c8. Initiating a forceful knight sortie, the knight on f5 launches a decisive check, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and disrupt its precarious position, potentially forcing further concessions. Focusing on the bishop's new outposts, the king's exposed position on the 7th rank offers no respite, as the knight's pressure from f5 demands immediate attention and defensive maneuvering to prevent further material loss or a swift checkmate. Snatching that pawn at c6 forces a decisive tactical resolution, simplifying the board and leading towards a pawn-up endgame for white, a welcome development after the earlier complications. Unleashing a daring knight sortie into the opponent's territory, this thrust aims to disrupt white's pieces and potentially create mating threats around the exposed king.